and talk about a project. Some of you have heard me talk about this project before, but I'm going to be coming at it from a different angle than you've probably heard me talk about it before. Thinking about viral media back before the Civil War. So my scholarship is all on American literature before the Civil War, and I'm interested in the ways that information circulated around the country at the time. And part of the reason why I'm excited to be part of this cohort is I've been using these metaphors of viral media to describe the things that I study. And one of the things we've been thinking about as a group is really how sufficient that metaphor is, and in what ways it's useful and in what ways it's not useful. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the reason why I sometimes discuss the 19th century newspaper as a kind of proto-internet. We're in a place today, right, where we experience pretty much all the media that we experience through the same screen, right? Our music, our news, our photographs, right? Everything is coming through the computer. And in some ways, the 19th century newspaper was itself an all-purpose medium. It didn't look like a modern newspaper in that it didn't just contain news. For a lot of people, it was their primary access to any kind of textuality. And it included, if you look at, this is just, I quite literally picked almost a random newspaper page from the data set that we've been working with. This is the Middlebury Galaxy from Vermont, and on this one page we can see something that looks like news, right? This is a report of military activity. We have something that is an editorial. There are those who would sell the birthright of our nation's glory for a mess of official pottage, right? So this is a kind of shake the beast. There you go. But we also have a poem, and most 19th century newspapers would have printed poetry. We also have a story. This is fiction. This is not news. And we also have this odd thing that they're calling an anecdote, which is a sort of quasi-news story that's neither true nor untrue. It's all on this one page, right? And this is the primary sort of reading medium for many Americans during the period. And not only that, but this is before modern copyright law, so a lot of these little pieces circulated from newspaper to newspaper, sometimes with and sometimes without attribution. So you guys noticed that John Greenleaf Whittier poem in that first paper? Well, it appeared in lots of papers, sometimes with different titles. It went from being the Huskers to being the Corn Song. It had a few other names as well as it circulated. And there were really no restrictions on this kind of circulation. Things just got reprinted in paper after paper. Sometimes the titles would change, sometimes the names of the authors would change, sometimes the text itself would change. And so this is the culture that I'm really interested in, this kind of circulation of text around the country during the period. Scholars have written about this. Meredith McGill is probably the most well known for talking about this culture of reprinting, which she really says is at the heart of 19th century textual practices. But actually sort of getting at this kind of reprinting in any sort of big way is really difficult in the archive, because basically what it means is you've got to just sit down and read all of the newspapers, right? And there are millions and millions of pages, and you've got to just index them as you go and compare them. And basically, it's impossible to do. So I, since getting to Northeastern, I've been working with David Smith in computer science to develop ways of automatically finding these reprinted texts in these huge historical archives that we have of newspapers. And this has been really successful so far. We've built an index of about 40,000 reprinted texts, or what we've been calling viral texts, using just the Library of Congress's collection. So it's actually not even the majority of 19th century newspapers. And most of these are things that scholars have never really looked at before, which is exciting to me. So what kinds of things went viral in the 19th century? There are recipes. I selected these because I sort of want you to be imagining what your Facebook feed looks like, right? For me, it's not dissimilar. There are recipes. This to make your own starch for cleaning, which I'm sure you're all going to run out and make your own gum Arabic starch this evening. There are lots of sort of treacly exhortations to live better. Some of these are religious, some of these are not, right? But these are inspirational messages that no doubt your aunt or uncle or someone posts on Facebook on a regular basis, right? Maybe your mom if she's on Facebook. Again, also, just like on the internet, there were lists. Lists are very popular. This is a list of maxims to guide a young man These are all sort of principles that men should follow to be upright citizens, right? Think of the BuzzFeed list, right? And then 19 things you remember about the 80s or whatever. There were a lot of lists, actually, that went viral.
Keep good company or none.
Good company or none, yes. Yeah. Well, one of my favorites on this, without getting into the weeds, but it actually says, if I can find it, have no very intimate friends. There you go. This is the lesson you can take away. Have no very intimate friends that want to be an upstanding person. Lots of religious messages, right? The religious sentiment is very common in the 19th century newspaper. Oh, sorry, that's where it was going to zoom in. And then these sort of quasi-truthful things are actually really common. And actually, these remind me quite a bit of the things that you maybe get. At one time, they would have come via email. Now I think they come via Facebook, and you would immediately go to Snopes, right? Your right-wing uncle sent you this thing about how Obama is actually killing kittens or something, and you go to Snopes. That's really not true. Anyway, you have a lot of these sort of vaguely sourced things. So what I've been thinking about as part of this program is, okay, so how is this viral metaphor useful for thinking about these historical texts? And I think it is useful in certain ways, right? I think that it helps us to connect historical practices to modern information exchange. A lot of my work, a lot of my teaching is really invested in thinking about technology not as a recent phenomenon, but as something that human beings have been doing pretty much as long as we've been around. And I like to make these sorts of connections, both in my teaching and my research. Viral is a kind of organic metaphor to describe organic exchange. So later in the 19th century, you get these sort of formalized systems of exchange, like the AP, the Associated Press, where a bunch of papers have agreed we're all going to share content. But we're really looking before that, right? When sharing is more who you know, organic, and somehow that organic metaphor is maybe appropriate. I think that these viral models can help us to make systematic approaches to something that we tend to study at a very minute level. And I think that it helps the public connect to this sort of obscure historical research. And as evidence to that, I was going to brag just a little bit and say, we just got written up in Wired. Right? So our project, the Wired people were very interested in talking about it. And I actually think this kind of public outreach is really important, right? And I think because we call it viral, right, there's a kind of a hook that people who are not necessarily interested in 19th century literature, I know most people are interested in 19th century literature, people who aren't, can kind of hook in and see this thing that connects to their everyday lives, right? And then there are things that we can do with this, right? I'm very interested in these sort of systemic ways of using these reprinted texts to figure out how print culture worked in the 19th century. We can map the spread of particular texts. We can compare the spread of different kinds of texts and see if there are interesting differences in the way that, say, poems were exchanged versus the way political news was exchanged, right? Just a few examples of that here. We can look at these texts as sort of symbols of where the sort of print centers during the 19th century were. Where were people printing things that everyone else was reprinting, right? And we can even use this kind of textual data to map the 19th century print as a network, right? Who are the publications that are printing the things that all the other publications want to print? Who are the sort of centers of print culture? And there are interesting observations that come out of this. You begin to learn that there are papers in Nashville, Tennessee, and papers out in the Midwest, or actually what was at the time the West, who were fairly central to exchange. And literary scholars don't tend to look at those places. We tend to focus on New York and Boston and Philadelphia. And we're learning that the print network really depended on a lot of these more rural newspapers for these kinds of exchange systems. Okay, but why not viral? Why is viral problematic? There are a number of reasons for that too. And one of them is right here. I mean, when we talk about viral media, we tend to talk about a very personal kind of sharing. I see this thing, I share it with my friends, right? It has to do with social networks. But when we're looking at 19th century newspapers, we're still looking at edited content, right? There are editors who are making these decisions, who are in charge of these papers. And the kinds of exchanges are not happening organically among the general population, but among this very narrow band inside the population. It's also somewhat problematic, I think, because of time. When we talk about something going viral, we mean something that gets millions of clicks in a few days, right? It tends to be this incredibly brief time span. But even for our fastest spreading stories, we're talking about months of spread. And some of these things that we're looking at spread over years or even decades, right? So they're stories that continue to be reprinted over these huge swaths of time, which I think don't quite line up with the way people use viral today. It's also problematic because we can't measure it at such a granular level, right? We can actually say, we know that 3 million people at least looked at this photograph or looked at this story. They might have read it from end to end, but they at least looked at it. But there's no like button in the 19th century newspapers, right? And what we can know is that 50 papers printed this story, but it's impossible to know how many people actually read it, right? We can't measure at that kind of granular level. And some of these papers had circulations of hundreds, some of these had circulations of thousands, and circulation data is actually really pretty difficult to get at for a lot of these newspapers. At the same time, so this Robert Payne article is one that we read as a group, and he talks about like actually as itself kind of problematic because it's this binary. You click like, but by clicking like, you're signaling so many different possible things. You might be saying, I actually like this thing. You might be saying, well, it's a picture of my nephew, so I better like it, or they're going to think I'm a bad aunt or uncle, right? You might just be sort of trying to increase the signal for a friend, right? There are all of these reasons that you might be liking something, and there's no way to dislike something. It's an on-off switch, right? So it's actually hard to glean too much meaning simply from likes. Although in some ways, reprinting is also a flat signifier, which is to say editors in the 19th century reprint things for all kinds of reasons as well. Sometimes they reprint things that they think are idiotic so that they can talk about how idiotic they are. Sometimes they reprint things that they really do like or that they want to share. So the big question always comes down to this idea of agency, right? People who don't like the viral metaphor often don't like it because it sort of removes the human from the picture. It implies that things spread because they spread, and removes the sort of conscious choices of people to spread things. In some ways, the more I study this stuff, the more complicated agency gets for me, which is to say there are all of these motivations beyond just liking, even in the 19th century, right? You could spread something because you like it. You could spread it because your colleagues are printing it. A lot of these 19th century papers are they're Democratic papers or Republican papers or Baptist papers. And you could be printing it because all the other Democratic papers are printing it, right? You could be printing it to say what a load of BS that is. You could be trying to just demonstrate that you have a wide reach, printing things from all over the country, printing things from all over the world. You could be printing because you need to fill 3 inches in order to print your issue for the day, right? There are all of these reasons. And we also have a lot of evidence that editors spread things because their readers ask them to. We have these instances where an editor says, our readers have repeatedly solicited us to republish this, so here it is, right? So the editor is not all controlling. So that's it. Those are my problems, and I'm hoping we'll talk about them.
Thank you.